Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Unlearning Economics channel. Today, I'm really happy to have with me Gary Stevenson. He's a former city trader who has a master's degree in economics, and since COVID, he's been running a YouTube channel called Gary's Economics, which I highly recommend that you all check out. So, hi, Gary, and thanks for coming.
Hi.
So one of the things that I like about your channel is that you're really good at explaining quite simple points, but quite compelling points in a way that I think virtually anyone can grasp. And I guess that's one of the main purposes of the channel, really. Like, you want to communicate economics to people who maybe don't know much about economics and don't know all the jargon and everything like that.
Yeah.
So, with that in mind, your very first video was about how COVID increased inequality. So could you maybe talk us through that argument and like how you came to it and why you thought it would be good to put it out there on YouTube?
Yeah, so I guess to understand why I took that angle, you probably need to know a little bit about my background. So I'll just give like a bit of information on that, which is, as you mentioned, I was a city trader for a long time. I was a trader from 2008 until 2014. And what I was trading was interest rates. Um, and it's actually a really interesting history, that period of time for interest rate predictions, because in 2008, all the interest rates went to zero. And everyone thought that they'd come up again in 2009. That's sort of traders, economists, central banks, whoever you ask. But they were wrong. In 2009, they said it'd be 2010. In 2010, they said it'd be 2011. 2011, they said it'd be 2012. And if you were to ask an economist in early 2020, when will rates go up, they would have said later that year. So there was 13 consecutive years there of markets incorrectly predicting interest rates. So because that was my job, I basically tried to figure out why it is that economists were so consistently wrong on interest rates. And the reason they were predicting a bounce back in rates was because they expected a very strong economic recovery, and that recovery kept not happening because people weren't spending enough money. So I spent a lot of time sitting and thinking, why aren't people spending enough money? And we can talk in a bit more detail about this if you'd like. But I basically came to the conclusion that people weren't spending money because they didn't have much money, because the various kinds of stimulus which were being pumped into the economy after 2008 were ending up with richer people who were saving it, or more accurately, buying my mates' mum's houses, and ordinary people were losing their wealth and didn't have much money. So fundamentally, that means it's a problem of inequality. So my background as a trader was I made a lot of money by predicting there would never be a recovery because of a problem with inequality. And I think in markets, it's been really consistently quite easy to make money if you understand what's happening with inequality, because markets, and I think by extension economists in general, just do not have a firm grip on what a serious impact inequality has on the economy. So whenever anything big changes, the first thing I want to do is always understand what's going to happen to inequality. And COVID was super interesting, right? Because we all know that the government gave out an enormous amount of money during COVID, right? But it wasn't immediately obvious who that money was going to. And what I mean when I say that is, we all know, for example, that there was a furlough scheme and the government spent an enormous amount of money on the furlough scheme. And we know that money went to furloughed workers. But there's a question of, if the government gives out £450 billion, which is an enormous amount of money, £10,000 per person, society as a whole must get £10,000 per person on average richer. But if you look at these furloughed workers, they're not getting richer, because that money they're getting from the government is just replacing their ordinary wages. And it's actually at a lower rate, right? They're getting 80% of their normal wages. So even though the money's going to furloughed workers are getting poorer. So who's getting richer? So I spent a lot of time in the beginning of COVID trying to work out sort of this sort of Sherlock Holmes mystery, right? We know this huge amount of money is being poured in, but the people who are receiving the money are getting poorer. So who's getting richer? So I just sort of followed the cash flows around the system, right? The reason that the furloughed workers are getting poorer is because they're not getting their wages anymore. All right, so who's got the wages? Well, wages are normally paid by companies, so let's look at the companies. Well, if you look at the companies, you'll actually see the companies didn't get richer during COVID, and that's because the companies were closed down, right? So even though the companies are not paying wages, they're also not receiving their usual income. So who's got the money which normally goes to the companies? Now that's the customers. And it's actually the customers who got richer during COVID. And that's because customers were not spending any money. And when you consider that the amount of money that was given out was huge, £10,000 per person, a lot of people watching, listening to this might think, well, I'm a customer. I didn't get £10,000 richer. So, I don't see that £10,000. And the reason for that is it wasn't all customers that got richer, right? So if you're, a relatively ordinary person, an ordinary financial position, most of your expenditures are things like rent, mortgage, food, bills. These expenditures remained during COVID. The expenditures which disappeared were non-essential, discretionary, luxury expenditures. So the amount of money that you accumulated as an individual during COVID was basically exactly proportional to the amount of your usual luxury spend or discretionary spend, if you prefer to call it that. So who has the most luxury spend? Well, luxury spend is a really good proxy for basically how rich you are. So what happened during COVID was that rich people totally stopped spending money. And the richer you were, the more money you accumulated. And essentially what the government was doing when it pumped money into the economy was kind of indirectly subsidizing what would normally be the expenditure of the rich. So from a distribution perspective, what lockdown does is it cancels the expenditures of the rich and the incomes of the poor. Because ordinary people still have their normal expenditures, but the expenditure of the rich have been cancelled, and that drives up ordinary people's wages. So as soon as you do a lockdown, you start seeing money accumulate with rich people and debt accumulate with poor people. And when the government comes in and gives money to the poor, all that really does is shift the loss from ordinary working people to the government. And it does nothing about the accumulation of cash with the rich. So as soon as you do the analysis, you can realize, and I don't think it's that complicated, you can realize that it was inevitable that during COVID, we would see a truly enormous accumulation of cash with richer people. And that COVID would essentially represent an enormous transfer of wealth from the government to the rich. And I think it's probably the fastest and biggest ever increase in wealth inequality in history. And, as somebody who's, made millions of pounds betting that inequality destroys the economy, what I was seeing was basically an inevitable long-run economic disaster, right? Because inequality was increasing enormously. Nobody was talking about it. And it still drives me mad how few people in the media talk about this enormous increase in inequality in the last 2 or 3 years. And, that will have all of the consequences that inequality always has on an economy, which we can talk about more, which I talk about a lot on my channel. I've built a website about. So, for me, when COVID happened, as an inequality economist, I wanted to see what would happen to inequality. And you could predict very easily you'd see an enormous increase in inequality. And as a consequence of that, I said we'll probably see a big increase in house prices, a big increase in inflation, a squeeze in general living standards. And now we're, of course, seeing all of those things happen. So what I'm doing now is basically trying to explain to people, look, this is what happens when you print an absolute crap ton of money and give it to rich people. And I think it's amazing that we did that as a society, and no one in the economics profession seems to talk about it. It drives me a little bit mad.
So your argument is essentially that when COVID hits, what you have is a big shutdown of a lot of the economy, barring the essential services, right? And the issue there is that poorer people mostly spend money on essential services, rent, bills, food, right? All of the sectors of the economy that kept going. But what we were able to shut down without losing our ability to survive as a country were what you could, I guess, call luxury services, but not just luxury, slightly, less necessary services, non-necessities, let's call them.
Yeah.
And those are the things that if you have more income, you tend to spend your money on. So what happens then is that the middle class, and especially the richest people, tend to accumulate more in savings, right? And they, whereas before they might have been spending that, and it would then kind of go back to companies and then, circulate back throughout the system. Now it's just sort of piling up. I mean, this is what I said about a very deceptively simple but quite compelling argument. It makes a lot of sense.
What's super interesting about it is, from the perspective of an ordinary person, you don't see this, right? Because an ordinary person has lost their wages and they get instead of furlough income. And, when money hits your bank account, it doesn't come with like a little description of where the money's come from, right? You lost one form of income, you got another form of income. It's a little bit less, but it's okay. You can survive on it, right? And what you don't realize is behind the scenes, money which used to come from the spending of the rich is now coming directly from government, who essentially printed the money. That's another thing we can talk about. And what happened was we moved from a kind of circular cash flow economy where the rich spend a lot of money, that drives wages for a lot of people, and then ordinary people give that money back when they pay their bills, when they pay their mortgage, when they pay their rent. We moved to a kind of linear economy where the government just prints the money. That's what pays your salary, government printed money. And then when you pay your bills, it then goes to the rich, and the rich just keep it. And I think what I think is really quite damning of the economics profession is that £450 billion was given out during COVID. That is a matter of indisputable fact. And at no point did a single person in academia, in central banking, in government, in think tanks, in the media, at no point did anybody say, okay, if we give out £450 billion, who's going to end up with it? You know what I mean? Nobody did that analysis. And I think that is really absolutely amazing. But having been in economics a long time, unfortunately, I'm not surprised by it. But somebody has to end up with it. You give out £450 billion, somebody gets £450 billion. And that is £10,000 for every adult in the country. So if anyone is listening, watching, and they do not have £10,000 cash more in their bank account than they had 3 years ago, someone else has got your £10,000. And this cannot be argued. This is pure accounting. If somebody gives out £450 billion, then everyone else gets £450 billion. And you have to ask where the money's ended up. And I think we also should be asking, why is nobody else asking this question? Where is the serious, rigorous analysis and criticism on economics coming from? Why has nobody asked it?
Yeah, I agree on that front. I mean, and it's worth saying that, as you underscored at the beginning, there has been quite a big rise in inequality. So in that sense, the major facts of inequality are on your side, right? There's an increase in inequality to be explained. There wasn't when you first made your video, so I mean it was quite a good prediction. But now there has been a big increase in inequality. I don't think that's in dispute. The wealthiest have increased their wealth by a lot, and the poorest have arguably lost out. So
22% was the average increase in millionaire and billionaire wealth in the first year of COVID. 22%
in 2020, or the first year after lockdown.
In the first year, like after lockdown, yeah, 2021. It's the biggest ever single year increase in millionaire and billionaire wealth, and I think it was predictable. I mean, I predicted it. I think the analysis, is there. It's clear, anyone can see it.
So let me just interrogate the mechanism a little bit here, because I had this thought. So you said, one of the things you said was that people are who are spending money, that money is eventually ending up in the hands of the rich. So there's almost two things going on, right, in your explanation. One is that when richer people receive money, they're more likely to save it. But the second is that you're saying that all the money that goes to poorer people eventually funnels upwards to richer people. So could you explain that a little bit more? Because, I wonder, why doesn't, for example, say I pay off a bill, a gas bill to be concrete, why does that end up in the hands of the rich as opposed to kind of circulating back through the economy, back through the essential workers who work for the gas company and so on?
Yeah, so not every penny or pound that is spent by an ordinary person goes to the rich. So I think the first thing to understand, because I think actually this is often not well explained, and a lot of people don't really intuitively understand this, is basically every time you or anyone spends money, that money gets essentially split, and some of the money that you spend goes to the workers. Let's assume you go and you buy a restaurant you buy a meal in Wetherspoons, all right? So some of that money is going to go to the people working in Wetherspoons, and some of the money is going to go to the people who own Wetherspoons. Some of the money is going to go to people who own that building, or who own the debt. Every single time you spend money, you go and buy your food at Sainsbury's, right? Some of it goes to the workers, some of it goes to the owners of the land, some of it goes to the owners of the energy that sent it there. Every single time you spend money, there's a split. Some of it goes to workers and some of it goes to owners. I think that's an important thing for people to realize. But some things are way more owner heavy than others. For example, when you pay your mortgage, that goes almost entirely to the people who lent you the money. There's not much labour involved. And when you pay your rent, I mean, there is a little bit of work probably that goes in people who maintain the property, but it largely goes to the owners. So not everything you spend as an ordinary person goes to the rich, but there's a balance, right? There's net cash flows, right? So when you as an ordinary person spend money, a lot of it does go to the rich. You know, when you buy food, for example, it goes to the rich. And when rich spend their money, a lot of it goes to ordinary people. There's a balance, basically. And that balance it's not in equilibrium because we see wealth inequality is increasing. And that implies that the more money is going from the poor to the rich than from the rich to the poor, because it's sort of similar to the economic idea of a capital account and a current account, right? If wealth is transferring from ordinary people to the rich, which I think it clearly is, then that means there's a mismatch in basically the cash payments that is being settled by this like transfer of wealth. So that exists in a sort of fragile balance, and the last 20 years has shown that wealth is transferring to the rich anyway. But when you have this shutdown of non-essential services, the percentage of your income that you spend on non-essential services is totally related to how rich you are, you know. And you know, anyone who is in a poor family, I grew up in a very poor family. Poor families' expenditures will have dropped almost nothing during COVID because they spend basically nothing on non-essential services, right? All of their expenditure is on things which they absolutely have to spend, right? Whereas if you're rich and you have luxury holidays, then, you know, rich people can spend 20, 50, 100,000 pounds a year on holidays, right? So suddenly they're going to accumulate 100,000 pounds a year. So it's not a simple case of the money that ordinary people spend goes to the rich and the money that rich people spend goes to the poor. But as soon as you smash one side out of the equation, as soon as you absolutely smash spending of the rich, then it is inevitable you'll have an imbalance and you'll start to see flows of wealth from the poor to the rich. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you can also say that generally, even outside of COVID, richer people are more likely to save and accumulate money as well, right? So it's like it kind of massively accelerates that mechanism by basically disallowing them from spending whatsoever. I mean, it's worth saying there's also these like more direct mechanisms that increased inequality during the pandemic, right? Because we had like some sort of corporate bailouts, right? And at the same time, so there was quite a lot of outrage initially because there were kind of corporate bailouts. You know, they were receiving money for furlough and so on, as well as like cheap central bank loans, while they were also laying off workers. So that was like a really yours is a bit more indirect, right, and cumulative, whereas this was a direct one. So I'm guessing they both work together.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, the net result was a huge increase in inequality, and I think the analysis should have been done early on, and I think it's just what it tells you, and is that basically economics as a discipline has a problem of understanding the importance of the wealth distribution. I think it tends not to look at it, and you know, I've literally made millions of pounds just by understanding that one simple fact, basically, which is economists don't understand the wealth distribution. They don't think about the wealth distribution. So whenever something big happens, you can just step back and say, well, what will this do to the wealth distribution? And you will probably be able to predict better than the mainstream because they're missing this one important thing.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about the economics profession in a bit, but I want to talk more about inequality. So we've spoken about inequality and how it's increased, right? And so one thing that you often hear is like, okay, so why is this necessarily bad in itself? Like, what's the problem with inequality? How does it hurt people if some people have more money than others?
Okay, so if people want like a totally like full description of this, I'll point to my website, which I made 7 years ago. It's called wealtheconomics.org. So if people want like my total full explanation of this, it's all written up there. But I'll package it up. I mean, it basically comes down to the simple fact that ordinary people spend the vast majority of the income they make in their lifetime, and rich people save the vast majority of their income in their lifetime. And that's a gradual effect. The richer you are, the more likely you are to save any income that you get. And this is, you mentioned it basically before, and economists call this marginal propensity to consume or whatever. But the simple answer is that rich people save a lot of money, and ordinary people spend a lot of money. So once you start to increase wealth inequality, and I think it's important that people understand the difference in wealth inequality and income inequality. We're not talking about sort of doctors and lawyers here. We're talking about sort of families that have accumulated, tens, hundreds of millions of pounds of wealth, billions of pounds of wealth. Consider, for example, you are a person with £1 billion, right? That wealth generates income, okay? So, if you have £1 billion in wealth, which is, about what Rishi Sunak has, you'll generate an income every year about 30 to 50 million pounds. So imagine you're that guy, you're getting paid 30, 50 million pounds a year just for getting out of bed. How much money are you going to spend? How much money would you spend if you were making that 30, 50 million pounds a year? Just passive income. That's a question
Well,
for you.
a question for me. Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't know. It's difficult to imagine, but like not very much of it, like a really small
Well, see, that's the
percentage
thing,
on what I
if
needed.
yeah, exactly. If you were making 30, 50 million pounds a year, what you'll do is you'll spend £4 million a year. You'll live like the Queen. You live a life of unbelievable luxury, spending £4 million a year, and you'll use the other £24 million to buy assets. And simple economic theory will suggest, okay, well, these guys are saving a lot of money, so it should sort of benefit growth in the economy. We can interrogate that idea, but the simple fact of the matter is, since 2008, that is not what has happened. All right, because if wealth inequality gets too high, then you'll simultaneously get this small number of very wealthy families with enormous incomes trying to save all of it, and you will have at the same time the broad mass of most of the people losing their money. This is the killer fact for me, right? So I was sitting on the trading floor trying desperately to understand why are people not spending money, all right? And yet, so I'm 35 now. I exist in a generation where most of my friends' parents own property, and most of my friends will never own property. So if you consider then the situation of ordinary families, they're going from being property owning to non-property owning, right? Which means that they are dissaving over the long term. They're becoming poorer over the long term. They're spending more than their income over the long term. And yet we simultaneously have and have had for about 15 years now an economic problem of not enough spending in society. So I think if you have those two things simultaneously, I don't think you can come to any conclusion other than the problem is lying with the fact that the rich are so rich, basically, because they are sucking spending power and wealth out of the hands of ordinary people. And the big penny drop moment for me was in the beginning of 2011, I got called into a meeting with one of Citibank's economists. And he went through the fiscal positions of a lot of the world's major governments, Spain, Italy, Portugal, Greece, Ireland, but also the UK, the US, Japan. And these governments have been for a long time in situations where they spend more than their incomes and they run further and further into debt and they dissave their assets. And there was a real symmetry here between the position of the world's governments and the families of the people I grew up with, which is they are moving from being wealth holding to losing their wealth. And if that is what is happening, then as an economist, you can't really ask, why are you guys not spending more money? If somebody is dissaving over time, it doesn't make any sense to ask, why are you not spending more money? Because they're already spending more than their income, right? So the only way you can fix this problem is by getting spending out of the rich. And if you don't fix this problem, it will spiral in on itself, right? Because if ordinary people and governments are losing their wealth over time to the rich, well, that will increase the rate at which ordinary people and governments have to pay money to the rich to use that wealth, which means the rich will get richer quicker and the poor will get poorer quicker, which will then increase again the rate at which ordinary people have to give their money to the rich. So I think it's, what, for undergrad I did maths and economics, and I think if you look at this mathematically, what you see is this is a very, very unstable system. This is a system where wealth is gradually at first, but at a pace which is speeding up, transferring away from the broad mass of people to the very rich. And we're basically losing our middle class. And the reason that this country and other Western countries have had good standard of living in the last 50 years is because they've had a big property owning middle class that has wealth, and that will not be true in the future. And it leads to the obvious consequences, right? Spending power gets transferred from ordinary people who buy goods and services to the rich who buy assets. Assets become very expensive. Wages become low, and you end up with just a very low broad quality of living. And that was my conclusion back in 2011 after that meeting, and I put a bet on that the global economy would never recover, and that bet made me Citibank's most profitable trader in the world. And I've gone on, for 10 years now, consistently betting on progressive disaster in the global economy, and I've made millions of pounds doing that. And I don't want to do that anymore. I don't want the global economy to collapse. But it obviously will if this is the system you're in.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the one of the things I noticed about your channel, I mean, income. You talk about both. You were talking about both income and wealth inequality there, but it seems like wealth inequality is one of your biggest concerns, actually, and especially housing, because and it was also one of the key mechanisms when you were talking about how COVID has kind of funneled money to rich people, because obviously either rents or mortgages are a lot of people's biggest expense. So, could you maybe speak a little bit to housing specifically and how that fits into your framework?
Yeah, I mean the big important difference in wealth and income is most people can work, you know, and income inequality, it is at least related to work. Okay, and every 30 years a new generation is born, and different people have different talents, and some people will be able to get good jobs, and some people will not be able to get well-paid jobs. But wealth inequality compounds upon itself because people who do not have wealth continually have to pay money to people who do have wealth. If you're out there and you do not own a home, you have to pay money every month to somebody who owns a home. If you are out there with a big mortgage, you have to pay money every month to somebody who owns your mortgage. Okay, so wealth inequality is self-compounding. That is the power of compound interest. So if wealth becomes very unequal, then that means most people start to pay a lot of money every month to a tiny minority of people. Is that a stable system? If wealth inequality is high, then you are in a space where the vast majority of people pay almost all of their income every month to a tiny minority of people who, of course, then have an enormous income. So is that a stable system? It's not a stable system because it will feed upon itself and it will become more unequal. And, housing is just the most obvious manifestation of this, right? Because then if the rich have loads and loads of income, what rich people do, and, I don't hate rich people, I'm a rich person myself. What rich people do is they buy assets. So if you give them all the assets and a huge amount of income, they will use that income to buy more assets from each other, and they will push asset prices up to unbelievably high levels. And, I've been having this argument with people for 10 years where they say, look, London housing is so expensive. There's no way it could get more expensive. It used to be 2 times income. Now it's 20, 25 times income. And I say, I'm sorry to tell this to you, but you're wrong. London housing will get more expensive. If you want to see how expensive it can be, look at what housing multiples were 100 years ago in this country, when the country was really unequal. Look at what housing multiples are like in Mumbai. Look at what housing multiples are like in Hong Kong or in Moscow, in really, really unequal cities. I think it is totally the norm for very, very wealth unequal places to have completely unaffordable housing. And if you take a broad global historical scope, you will realize that really affordable housing is a historical anomaly which existed in the West for 50 years when wealth inequality was very, very low, unusually historically low. And wealth inequality is not going to stay low, it's going higher. And that means that housing affordability will get significantly worse. Significantly worse. I honestly think there's a very good chance that housing prices in London and in the UK broadly will double in the next 5 or 6 years because of what's happened during COVID. We're already seeing that. I predicted that at the beginning of COVID. Look, if you give all of the wealth to a tiny group of people, then they will use that to extort the rest of the wealth from the rest of the people. And that's not because they're bad. It's just because they're rich. That's what rich people do. They will have huge amounts of income and they will use that income to buy the rest of the wealth. It's not a good picture, but, that's what I think will happen. And I've been betting on it for a long time and I've been right for a long time.
So I mean, would you say that wealth inequality is? I mean, I don't know if you've done any sort of statistical work on this. I don't know the nature of your work at Citibank, but would you say that wealth inequality is potentially the best predictor of like the house price to income ratio?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, of course, there's things to consider. If you are in, for example, an enormous country with vast quantities of land that could be spread into huge amounts of resources, then that's going to have an effect. But I think over time, as countries sort of develop and mature, then I think yes, it is. I think it's if you look at the last sort of 20, 30 years in the UK, and it's not at all specific to the UK. House prices in big cities have literally increased by about 10 times relative to wages. So that's not just nominal increase. That's like relative to wages. It's an absolutely enormous increase. That cannot at all be explained by supply changes. The normal argument that we need to build more, it just doesn't explain the reasons. It's not, if you look at amount of housing compared to population, that has not changed significantly in 40 years. And yet the house price to wage multiple has gone up 10 times. Yeah, I think that's what it is, and it's, I wrote my thesis on this when I was at Oxford, but the logic is not complicated, right? If you rich people buy assets, and the more wealth and income and power you give to rich people, the more expensive assets will be. How are you going to compete with that billionaire who has £30 million income a year? When you go out to buy houses, you are competing with him, be it directly or indirectly, because he might be funding your mortgages. Yeah, I think that's what I mean. I think, I was an interest rates trader, and really I was asking the question, why are interest rates so low? And I think this is, in my opinion, I think the way economists think about interest rates is quite stupid and extremely oversimplistic. I think interest rates are basically set by relative demand for spending and saving in the economy, and that is hugely affected by distribution, because rich people save vastly more than ordinary people. So, and if interest rates are low, that's the same as asset prices being high. And people talk about zero lower bound on interest rates. There's no such thing as a zero lower bound on interest rates, because zero interest rates would mean infinite asset prices. And I think that's where we will go. We will head towards that. You'll see. I'll be right. Wait 10 years. London housing will become significantly less affordable than it is now. And not just London. It will happen all over the Western world.
Could you explain that when you say zero interest rates would mean infinite asset prices? So what's going on there? What's the mechanism that you're pointing to there?
Look, everything has an interest rate, right? Like a house has an interest rate, which is, the rent over the price, right?
Hmm.
And we tend to think only about the interest on money. But, if you consider bonds, in financial markets, it's well understood that the interest rate of a bond is something which you calculate from the price of the bond, right? That is how you calculate the interest rate of a bond. The interest rate doesn't exist in isolation, right? There's a price, and that's how you calculate the interest rate. And you can do the same thing on anything, right? You can do the same thing on a house. You can do the same thing on a share of Apple stock. You can do the same thing on a plot of farmland. You can work out the interest rate on any of these things, right? And the interest rate can never reach zero on a piece of farmland, because as long as it has a positive yield, then it will have a positive interest rate, right? It can only approach zero as the price heads to infinity, right? But the price will never hit infinity. So I think the way economists think about interest rates is just laughably oversimplistic. If the rich have more and more and more money, they will push asset prices up more and more and more and more and more. Interest rates can never hit permanently zero, because if they were, then imagine you had access to a permanent zero interest rate, right? Permanent zero interest rate. How much would you pay for a house? Well, I could pay
anything.
I could pay £100 million for the house, right? And then I just borrow more money to pay the interest, right? I think the future is very, very low, zero real interest rates forever, if we do nothing about inequality. And the implication of that is ever rapidly increasing, not just house prices, but all asset prices. And that is simply because as inequality and relative power shifts, your ability as an ordinary person who does not own assets to compete for asset ownership with the very rich will diminish to zero. And that is what will happen. We will see increasingly ordinary people not owning houses, or if they do own houses, only doing it through really enormous mortgages, enormous amounts of debt. And that is inevitably what will happen, right? That is the inevitable consequence of an economy which is set up on ordinary people giving basically all of their paycheck every month to the rich, which is what happens now. If you're sitting there and you have nothing left after you've paid your rent and bills, well, your money didn't disappear. It went somewhere, and it went to the rich.
So, yeah, I mean, I've had, anecdotally, but, I've had friends in London who are trying to buy houses and they just end up getting outbid by massive investors or, companies.
Buyers.
Exactly what you were talking about. Thinking about like solutions. So you've spoken a little bit about a wealth tax, with your main focus being on wealth.
Yeah.
So could you give us an idea of like what type of wealth tax you'd like to see, or multiple taxes, what that would look like in practice?
The first thing is like to have a good understanding of the problem, right? The problem is that wealth inequality is increasing. Wealth is transferring from ordinary people to the rich. Ordinary families their wealth is decreasing. They're having less ownership of housing. They're having larger debts over time. That is not sustainable. You need to put that into reverse. And in order to achieve that, you need to have wealth starting to flow in the other direction. You need to start seeing wealth flowing from the very rich back to ordinary people. That's very, very difficult, right? Because, Rishi Sunak makes £50 million a year. So you need to start getting more than £50 million a year out of him. That's difficult, right? And what's crucial to understand is you will never achieve that by only taxing his income, because you need to get more than 100% of his income out of him every year. That's the only way to start wealth flowing out of him. Do you understand what I'm saying? It's impossible to achieve that by taxing only his income. You need to tax at some point the stock of wealth. So broadening taxation away from just income towards wealth is basically essential for the health of our economy. If we don't do that, we will continue to see these really serious, precipitous, and now quite fast falls in living standards. When it comes to how do you do that, I think it's important to realize there's not one magic bullet, okay? And when I talk about how to do it, I've basically got two questions in my head all the time. Number one, how effective is this as a strategy relative to the other strategies we can implement, the other kind of tax we can implement? And number two, how likely are we to actually get this realized? Because, there's a huge amount of political opposition to taxing rich people, because the rich people are very, very powerful. They have a big degree of influence in the media and over politics itself. So the reason I push the wealth tax is largely because I think this is the one we are most likely to achieve. And the most important thing for me is that the economy doesn't die. And you need to have something which starts getting big amounts of money out of the very, very, very rich. And a wealth tax could do that. The main thing is it needs to be taxing on their wealth, not their income. It's not the only way you could do it. So, for example, I've got an idea on my website, which is called the wealth time limit, which basically says you give rich people 120 years to spend their money, which is, more than obviously the lifespan of an ordinary person. You can make it more, you can make it 130 years. What that means is you give rich people 100 years to spend their money. They would need to start spending enormously more. They would need to start spending more than their income to start running their wealth down. And what that would do is it would start wealth flowing through the economy. It would cause an enormous economic boom. It would push wages through the roof. It would start transferring wealth to ordinary people. It would start making things like housing more affordable. So really, there are a lot of ways you can do it. And I'm not religious about which way we choose. But if we don't choose any of them, you are going to see this aggressive continuation of really serious impoverishment of most people in the country. And we're starting to see it affect more and more people now. So when we talk about wealth tax, the specific things to point out are it's on wealth, not income. We're not talking about taxing people with £1 million. We're talking about taxing people with £100 million. These are the guys you really have to hit. And I'm not in that category, but I would happily pay more myself on the condition that richer people pay it. You know what I mean? Because that's what you need to do to prevent the economy from dying, essentially. So look, I support a wealth tax because it would effectively prevent the death of our economy. It's not the only thing I support. I support any tax which is sensibly structured so that it doesn't have terrible side effects, that starts wealth transferring back to ordinary people. What I want is for ordinary people to get wealth back from the super rich. And anything that does that, basically, I'll support.
So I'm wondering, a lot of people are asking about this. I'm wondering if you've heard of, and if so, what you think of land value tax.
Value tax, is essentially a wealth tax. I think the only problem with the land value tax, the most obvious problem is there are some people who are very, very, very rich and don't own a lot of land. Like the obvious examples are Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg, the sort of tech billionaires, right? So a land value tax, depending on how it's structured, probably wouldn't really hit these guys. And you might end up hitting some people who are relatively rich but not super rich. If we're just thinking of an extreme example, think of somebody who is a farmer and they own a lot of land, but it's entirely debt funded. So maybe they own £100 million of land and they've got £80 million of debt. You're going to end up taxing this guy more than his entire net worth, potentially. So there's a degree of arbitrary unfairness when you start taxing some forms of wealth and not others. you always have to be very careful when you start taxing specific forms of wealth. And the reason for that is very rich people can afford to pay for a lot of accounting support. And once you start taxing only certain forms of wealth, you often see rich people do the paperwork that means their wealth is not included. You know what I mean? It's always a risk when you start taxing some forms of wealth and not others. There are other sort of theoretical problems which are, you know, I'm in my flat in Limehouse in East London. It's quite a nice flat. It's probably worth, not far off £1 million. But, it doesn't take up that much land because it's in a big block of flats. You know what I mean? So, there's this big sort of question of, once you start only taxing land, what is land? What economists like to call capital? But the big problem of it is it's not really the fairest way to do it, in the sense that some people are very, very rich and own not a lot of land, and some people are not that rich and own a lot of land. So I am, listen, it could definitely play a part, but I think we need to be realistic and say, land is no longer the overwhelming most important form of wealth that exists in this world or in this country. And if we only tax land, then it's limited in its redistributive power.
Yeah, there's an interesting argument against a land value tax that I've not really heard before. I mean, I'd be interested in what the Georgists think of it, because they're a very significant subculture on the internet. So I'm sure they'll have some things to say about it. But I think your point, I mean, it does lead me to the question. So you seem to want to tax total wealth, right? And this does lead to the question of, like, what is wealth? how do we tax it? Because that gets really difficult. And this would take like a 1,000-page policy document to truly work out. But I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts on measuring wealth and trying to make sure that we get the right people, which is something you seem to be concerned about, the various practical complications of taxing wealth.
Yeah, well, anyone is particularly interested in what is wealth, I have one of my most popular videos on my YouTube channel is titled "What is Wealth?" So I would encourage people to go look at that. I think it can actually be quite interesting to understand, because I think a lot of people perhaps don't understand that much what wealth is. But what we're talking about is, we add up all the stuff that you own, and we subtract off your debts, and what is left is your wealth, essentially. So if you own a house which is worth, say, £500,000, and you've got a £250,000 mortgage, then your wealth is £250,000. We'd add in your pensions and things like that. And I want to make it really clear, right? I'm not shooting for people who are worth £1 or £2 million. Yeah, I'm not worth massively more than that. I would be happy to pay more if it was as part of a tax system, if that functioned effectively. But really, the big problem is the super, super rich people. And, to be honest, I think actually valuing these people's wealth is not actually that difficult. I think once you start talking about very rich people, sort of £100 million or more, or even 20, 30, 40 million pounds, the amount of extra tax you could get from these people would massively outweigh the costs of valuing their wealth. Some people say that, the difficulties of valuation make a wealth tax impractical. And that's why I say, there's other solutions we can use. We can use a wealth time limit for lower wealth holders, and we can use a wealth tax for higher wealth holders. But really, the vast majority of wealth in this country is actually property. And that is both residential property and also commercial property. I think people don't really realize, for example, I'm near Canary Wharf, and those skyscrapers are all owned. When you go to do your shopping at Tesco or Lidl, other supermarkets are available. Somebody owns that building. When you go to the shopping centre, somebody owns that building. In this country, it's mainly property, and not just property, but also the debt on that property. So, for example, if you have a mortgage, somebody owns your mortgage. That is wealth for somebody. So really, it's not actually that complicated, and it's often not difficult to value. Often it's owned by companies, but most companies, in terms of total size, they're on the stock exchange, and we can value them. But it's really in this country, but it includes things like land and natural resources. I think it's actually really helpful for people to start thinking about the world in terms of wealth. So, walk down the high street and, look at all the shops and just realize somebody owns this stuff. And, look at your mortgage and realize, well, somebody owns my mortgage. I think people don't really realize that. Look at an office building. I can see the Shard out of my window right now, which is the tallest building in the country. Somebody owns that building. Really, ultimately, it's property, but it's also things like energy and food and the things that produce them. When energy prices go up and food prices go up, there's a lot of very rich people that own the land that makes food, and they'll be making a ton of this. I think it's really important because, I'm from a poor background, and people from where I'm from don't realize some people own massive farms and some people own skyscrapers. But they do. That stuff is owned. It's just not owned by us.
So, one criticism of this position on wealth, I think, specifically with regard to someone like Jeff Bezos or perhaps Elon Musk, is that when you talk about measuring their wealth, right, in terms of like the value of their company or what they own of their company, that people say, well, they don't really have that money. They say that's an unrealized gain, so you can't actually tax it. So what do you think about that argument?
Well, you definitely can tax it. I mean, there's no doubt. I mean, at the very least, you can tax it in kind, right? You can say, okay, well, you own X amount of Tesla stock. I think it's important to realize that these guys make income from their money. So I think 3 to 5%, maybe a bit less, is sort of realistic understanding of what they make. I've already mentioned the first year of COVID, these guys made 22% on their wealth, right? So even if we were to go to Elon Musk and say, we want you to give us 3% of your Tesla stock every year, that would just be him breaking even. It wouldn't be a loss. He'd still make, that would be less than the extra money he makes every year. You know what I mean? So, you can tax it in kind. If people say, well, it's unrealizable, well, he still owns the stock. You know what I mean? If we say we take a percentage of the things that you own, once you start getting above a certain level of richness, of course they can pay it. But I'm amenable to these ideas that none of these taxes are perfect. Well, personally, if you look at the time limit idea, which is my favorite idea, then what is beautiful about a time limit is it's zero tax, right? Imagine if you knew you had 50 years to spend £70 million, and anything that was left over would be taxed, fully. Well, you'd spend the £50 million, would you? You'd never pay the tax. And I think what that shows is, this is not really a question about big state, small tax, high tax, low tax. It's about who do you want to own your country? Do you want the whole country to be owned by a handful of people who are unbelievably rich? Or do you want your country to be owned by the majority of people who live in that country? And we are heading in a direction towards this country and many other countries being owned by a handful of people. And if you don't want that, then you have to change the flows of wealth. Because at the moment, wealth flows from ordinary families and from the government to the rich, which means ordinary families and governments will get poorer and the rich will get richer. This is, I was never a political person, okay? I don't want to do this. My job was to analyze the economy. My conclusion was the economy is heading into an absolute massive fucking disaster, and that will get worse and worse and worse over time. And I've been betting on that for 15 years, and I've made millions of pounds doing it. I don't want that disaster to happen. And the only way to stop that is to change the flows of wealth so that they stop flowing in one way from most people to the rich and start flowing back round. And if you don't achieve that, then it is inevitable that your kids and your grandkids will live in poverty because you're giving away your assets to a group of people who don't pay any taxes and, to be honest, probably don't really care about you that much.
So this idea of the timer is quite an interesting one because I've sort of been curious about making things more temporary. And I think if you go back to like the first corporations, there were actually like temporary licenses and things like land as well, land titles. You can also make those temporary, and you're sort of talking about making wealth or maybe money temporary as well, because I think one of the things about wealth, right, is that it accrues over time, right? History casts a long shadow in economics, and that shadow is wealth, really. So if you cut it off by making some ownership of some assets, whether it's stocks or land or corporate charters, things like that, if you make those temporary, then you might be able to arrest that process and stop it building up to such extreme levels like we have today.
Yeah. It's important to realize, when we talk about wealth building up, because sometimes I've said this idea to people. We said, like, look, we're going to put a time limit on wealth so that people have to get rid of the wealth they have. And then I've had people turn around and be like, oh, but then we'll all be homeless. It doesn't make the wealth disappear. It just makes the wealth go around. That wealth is going to be there. And it's a question of who owns it in 100 years' time. And the way we're going, it will all be owned by the grandkids of the people who own it now, basically. it's about a question of making it go around, making it go around. It's not making the wealth temporary. It's making ownership of wealth temporary. Really, this is a question of who do you want to own your country, living people or dead people? Because at the moment, I can tell you right now, you can bring a baby to me, and I can tell you how rich they'll be when they die. Seriously, and I don't think people realize this. I'm from a poor background, okay? Nobody from where I'm from made money. And then I went to a grammar school, and there were a lot of guys there who were comfortable middle-class families. They're all comfortably middle class now. And I went to LSE and I went to Oxford, and I studied with a bunch of rich people. They're all rich now. This is the world that we live in. We live in a world where I can tell you that when someone is born, how rich they'll be when they die. And, we have to ask this question of, is that what you want? Do you want this society where poor people will always be poor and where rich people will always be rich? Or do you want people to have a chance to make their own money and buy their own property and achieve things for themselves? And if that's what you want, then you have to tax accumulated wealth of super rich people rather than just income. Look at the situation we're in now, right? Okay, I come from a very poor background, and I know I made a lot of money. I made a few £1,000,000 working in the city, and that was to take me and my family out of poverty, right? And I paid 50% tax on that. At the time, there was a temporary top rate of income tax of 50%. At the same time as I was doing that, the Duke of Westminster inherited £8 billion and paid nothing. That is the world that we live in, all right? That is the world that we live in. And I think, you have to be realistic about what's happening here. What we have now, realistically, is a class-based tax system. If you are born in the ordinary class of people or in the poorer class of people, you pay tax. If you are born super rich, you don't pay tax. What is going to happen to wealth inequality in that situation? It's obvious. It's obvious, so, it drives me mad people not talking more about this. But, I just keep betting on the disasters, and the disasters keep happening. But, I would like to encourage the people listening to get behind this idea because we can stop it. We can stop, I think COVID is a great example of that, We're sitting here. This winter, half the country won't be able to turn the heating on. Half the country, United Kingdom. At the same time, the average billionaire increased their wealth by £620 million in 1 year. This is not a situation of everybody's hurting and the rich are just hurting a bit less. We are getting poor because the rich are getting richer. Look, no wealth was created in COVID, and yet the rich made an unbelievable amount of money. Now, if the rich make a ton of money while no wealth was created, that means you got poorer. The money didn't come out of nowhere, And then we come out of COVID, and everybody's much poorer, and we talk about it like there's nothing we can do about it. Well, £450 billion went to the rich. You could tax that, and you could increase the amount of cost of living support for ordinary families by 30 times. It's wild what's happening here, and it will inevitably lead to an ever worsening and increasingly serious disaster. And it brings me no joy in saying that, and I'll make money from it because I always do. But what I want to do is stop that disaster because I don't come from a rich background, right? I come from a poor background, and it's my friends and my family that will get hurt.
So you've alluded to it just there a little bit, which is the current cost of living crisis. Mm-hmm. So I want to know how your framework relates to inflation, current inflation specifically, and also what you think about the actions of governments, especially the UK government, but you can talk about other ones as well, in trying to alleviate this cost of living crisis.
I think it's important to realise that actually the actions of the UK government were very, very similar to the actions of most Western governments. It's really interesting, actually, economically, what happened during COVID, which was we kind of had this experiment of let's just imagine if we just gave everyone the money that they lost from the disaster. We just made everybody whole again. We just printed the money and gave it out. They froze the economy and then they replaced what was normally the spending of the rich with government spending of printed money. Really, really, really enormous. Hugely, hugely enormous, the amount of money given out during COVID. And I think that the economic narrative at the time was so childishly naive that were it not for the seriousness of the consequences, it would have been very funny. which is, we decided to fix a crisis by simply printing and giving out £450 billion. And nobody really questioned whether that would cause problems in the long run. And, there's a very simple reason why governments don't normally fix problems by just printing and giving out money. And that is because it has the potential to be inflationary. Okay? And I think we shouldn't really be surprised when after that we get inflation. The amount of money given out was £10,000 per adult. But most of that went to the richest people in society. So let's make the simplifying assumption so that we can think about this, that it all went equally to the top 10%. So that means that every single adult in the top 10% richest of society would get £100,000 each. So if you're, relatively well-off family, two parents, three adult kids, you get £500,000 cash, right? It's a lot of money, right? And that's not just you, that's everyone in the top 10%. And that money is there, this is not speculation, it's accounting. That money is there. That money is there, right? These guys got, the richest people inside have got £100,000 cash each. Okay, so now let's imagine it's 2019 and I came to you and I said, what do you think would happen as an experiment if we just printed 100 grand cash for every rich person in the country and gave them 100 grand cash? So let's run that. What do you think would happen if we did that? What do you think would happen if now the government said, we've got a new plan. What we're going to do is we're going to print 100 grand cash for every rich person in the country, the top 10%, and we're going to give every rich person in the country 100 grand cash. What do you think the consequence would be?
I mean, I would say, in my personal opinion, that it would probably increase the price of assets, whether housing or perhaps financial assets.
Yeah, and that was exactly what I predicted. I wrote some articles on this like at the beginning for a website called Open Democracy. People can go and look them up. Just search Gary Stevenson Open Democracy. That's exactly what I said. The first thing you'll see is that asset prices will go up. The problem is the rich own assets, right? Most of them. So what that means is the rich will struggle to buy assets like on aggregate. So there probably will be some buying of assets from the middle class by the rich, and there has been. But in general, when the rich get all this cash, this £500,000 per family, and they try and buy assets, all they're doing is shuffling the money around to one another. And at the same time, they put asset prices through the roof. So now, not only do they have £500,000 cash, but their net wealth is up by 20%, right? So what happens then, right? They can't get rid of the money, can they? Like, they can't get rid of the money. So what happens is assets become much more expensive relative to goods and services, and eventually they start spending the money, right? Like, what else are they going to do? They start increasing their consumption. They're not just going to sit on this £500,000 cash, every single rich family in the country. What happens first is assets go through the roof, and then eventually they start increasing their consumption. And, we talk about an economy in disaster. I bet you if you go down to London's luxury restaurants, there's no disaster. I bet you they're packed. I bet you they are absolutely packed. Because the rich have never been richer. The rich have never been... And listen, I know that this is not the mainstream narrative. And I know people turn around to me and say, no, you're wrong. The inflation was caused by the Iraq war. Okay. And look, that's fine, right? I'm used to this. I've been right for 15 years and every year people tell me the reason was wrong. It's fine. But I'm the guy that predicted this in advance, okay?
Did you mean the Ukraine war?
Yeah, sorry, what did I say?
Iraq.
Oh, sorry.
I was like,
my apologies.
Yeah.
The Ukraine war, because of the Ukraine war, right? Okay, everybody's saying, but first of all, the inflation started before the Ukraine war. Or people tend to forget that point inconveniently. And secondly, let's be realistic. We gave up £450 billion cash. I think if you don't think that's going to have any inflationary impact, I think you're being quite naive.
Yeah. Sorry, having some slight mic issues here.
That's all right.
So I just one other thing. Let me say two things. So one of them is, I think I am partly one of those people who thinks inflation is multifaceted. I mean, one of the things that is true of current inflation is that it's quite concentrated in specific sectors, and that's less and less true as it's becoming embedded. I've sort of accepted that. But I do think that, for instance, a lot of the shutdowns of industry across the world, especially like microchips, that was one of the big things that was like shut down, and we relied very much on East Asia
Yeah,
for our microchips. That was shut down, so that's
yeah,
been kind of like a supply side shortage, as
yeah,
opposed to one that's caused by money.
yeah, yeah. I'm not at all denying there have been supply side problems. I'm not denying that at all. Um, I'm just saying there's also been a massive distribution of helicopter money, basically. And in the example like the chip shortage, there's definitely a supply side issue there. But I mean, you talk about the inflation being isolated to specific sectors, but really, what's gone down? you know, you know, London rents going through the roof. What is that? Is that because of the Ukraine war? You know, London house prices are going through the roof. Even wages, London wages are rising. Is that because of the Ukraine war? We printed £450 billion, and then the price of pretty much everything went up. And yeah, of course, some things went up 20%, and some things went up 5%, but almost everything has gone up. And I think it's just there's a weird sort of collective madness here where people just simply deny that happened, that the money was a part of it. You know what I mean? You know, you know, the government borrowed and gave out £450 billion. Okay, that is what you would call in the markets taking a short position. You borrow it, you sell it. If you sell £450 billion, you're going to push the price of money down. Call me old-fashioned, but I believe that the price of things is affected to their supply, and that extends to money.
So another question I wanted to ask you about the current situation in the UK is we obviously have the Tory leadership contest at the moment, and there are only two candidates left.
Yeah.
I was wondering what you thought of their present, past, and kind of future positions on the cost of living crisis and the policies that they advocate, and whether you think they're going to sort of make the problem better or worse.
It's totally irrelevant to wins that leadership contest, and absolute total irrelevance. And I'll explain to you why in two simple numbers, right? The amount of money which was transferred from the government to the rich in the last 2.5 years is £450 billion. And the amount of money which the government has offered to fix the cost of living crisis, once you account for tax rises, is £15 billion. It's 30 times less, okay? So the amount of money which the government has given to rich people is 30 times more than the amount the government is using to fix the problem now. So what that means basically is that the problem won't be fixed. And I think anybody who thinks, I don't really like to say this, but people need to know, okay? Anybody who thinks that what is happening now with regards to cost of living is temporary will be wrong and will be proved wrong. This is not a temporary thing. And it is not only the case that it is not temporary, but it will continue to get significantly worse over the coming years, okay? Living standards will fall significantly over the next few years. And that is because inequality has increased significantly. And if you increase inequality significantly, then you increase the living standards of the rich significantly, and you decrease the living standards of the rest significantly. These are things which are obviously true. And I don't think the full effect has filtered through the economy yet. But not only that, the rich will use that money to buy assets from the rest of us, which means they will get richer and the rest of us will get poorer. And that will increase the rate of flow of cash from the rest of us to the rich, which will give them more money to buy assets from the rest of us. This inequality was killing the economy before this had happened. And as I say, I've said many times, I've been betting on that for 15 years and I've made millions of pounds doing it. But we've just increased inequality massively, unbelievably rapidly. So we've put that process, which was already killing the economy and killing living standards, into fast forward. So it doesn't matter who wins the Conservative. Nothing could be less relevant. Nothing could be less relevant because if they want to stop this crisis, they need to increase the size of their fiscal intervention by 3,000%. And that's not going to happen, is it? Realistically, these guys need to be looking at the fact that they gave £450 billion to the rich. They can get that back if they actually become serious about taxing the rich. And if they were to do that, then the crisis would end. But it's 30 times bigger than the fiscal interventions which they're talking about. So really, what you're talking about here is, which one of your needs you want to put a plaster on while you're on the Titanic, which is sinking. You know, that nobody in politics is talking in anything like the scale that is needed to fix this problem, which means it is absolutely inevitable that this problem will become significantly worse. And I don't like to say that, but people need to know that. And but what I would add is the problem is entirely fixable. All we need to do is become much more serious about taxing the rich. We need to recognize we've given the rich an unbelievably huge amount of money in the last few years. And the only way to fix that problem is to take an unbelievably huge amount of money from the rich. I'm sorry, but the way to fix giving a huge amount of money to the rich is to take a huge amount of money from the rich. But nobody is talking meaningfully about doing that. And that is why the crisis we are in was inevitable. And the fact that the crisis will worsen is also inevitable.
So people are asking specifically, and this is something that I wanted to get onto, when you talk about how you made money from betting that the economy would essentially stagnate or get worse. So could you talk us through like how exactly you did that and why you thought that, and you know the whole background there?
Yeah. So if people, there's a video which covers exactly this on my channel. So if people like want a really full detailed version, go and check that. I think it's called something like The Trade That Made Me Millions or whatever. Apologies for a clickbait title, but this is YouTube. Really, like very simply, like I came to the simple conclusion that if wealth inequality is super, super high, then real interest rates will stay zero forever or close to zero. Simply because there will always be this massive mismatch of spending and saving in the economy. So, but basically the 12, 13 years from 2008 to 2020 were a period of, at any point in those 12, 13 years, you could have asked an economist when will rates go up, or a journalist, and they would say, oh, in 6 months or a year. And they were wrong for the whole period. Rates never went up. So basically, I just bet for the whole period that rates would stay zero. And the way you do that is essentially you lend money in the future, because when traders expect rates will go up, then they will pay a higher rate to borrow money in the future because they think the rate will be higher then. So, you know, rates are zero, and I say to you, what rate will you pay to borrow money next year? And you'll say, I'll pay 2%. So I lend it to you for 2%, and then, you know, I lend you $1 billion at 2%. Time comes and the rate's zero, so I borrow the money back at zero. So I lent $1 billion at 2%, I borrow back at zero, and then I make $20 million. And I did that for 10 years, and it's absolutely ridiculous that was possible, but this is the world that we live in.
So one of the videos that you had, well, actually there are two videos about it. You contrasted this world of trading with the world of academic economics.
Yeah.
And I think essentially your main message is that in trading, you know, love it or hate it, and I do get the sense from you that you're not necessarily saying it's a morally good thing that you can bet on the economy getting worse and make loads of money. I don't know if that's right, but I get the sense that you're saying it's not necessarily morally good. It's just something that you've been able to do. But also what you say is in trading, you know, there are feedback loops, right? If you get something wrong, then you tend to lose money. And if you get something right, then you tend to gain money. And you contrasted that with academic economics, where there's just no such feedback mechanism.
Yeah. I mean, I told it, you've probably seen the video, right? But I think this one story captures it very well, which is, you know, I've gone on and on about it, but I was one of the top interest rates traders in the world, okay? And I made a lot of money by betting that interest rates would stay zero forever. And the markets and economists predicted for, 13 years they would go up, and they didn't. Then I recently went back to do a 2-year master's at Oxford, economics masters, and we had a lecture on monetary policy, which is interest rates, and this is my area, and it's an area that I love and I'm interested in. So at the end of the lecture, I went up to the professor and I was like, "Hey, great lecture. Can we talk about like why it was that economics as a discipline has been so wrong on interest rates for the last 10 years?" This would have been back in 2017. And he said to me, "Oh, no, we always knew rates were going to stay zero for a long time." And I don't even really know what to say about that, or like how I felt about that. It's quite shocking, because these guys were wrong for 10 years in a row, and they're not wrong about something insignificant, right? Because this is a proxy for sort of the broad strength of the global economy, right? They for 10 years they said next year things would be fine, and for 10 years things were not fine, and that has consequences, right? People fall into poverty, people lose their homes, you know, people's lives are blighted and ruined by that. Okay, and for 10 years that happened, and these guys said it wasn't going to happen, and that's bad. You shouldn't be wrong for 10 years if you're a professor at Oxford University. But he was not only wrong for 10 years. After 10 years of being wrong, he hadn't realized that he'd been wrong for 10 years. And that is just totally unforgivable. And really, what that says to me is that these university departments, you should just tear them down. Seriously. Because if these guys are able to be wrong for 10 years on something massively important, which affects billions of people, and which they are well paid to be world experts on, the fucking least they can do is realize they've been wrong. It's disrespectful and it's disgusting. And this guy studies at Oxford in a fucking castle, and he goes and eats in a fucking Harry Potter hall, you know what I mean, every day, and talks to his mates about how fucking smart he is. It's honestly and it's a joke. It's an absolute joke, and it's kids from where I'm from, around me, that can't afford to have fucking families, and this guy gets paid, I don't fucking know, 100 grand a year, 200 grand a year. What the fuck is he doing? How can he not know? How can he not know? It's unforgivable. Unforgivable. And that guy was the best professor in that place. Seriously. And I've got nothing against him personally. But these guys need to front up for what they're doing. Okay? And, I walked in and, I'm from a poor background, and, I'm not fucking handsome. I've got no connections. I talk like I'm from where I'm from. But I walked into the city, and within 3 years, I was famous in that place, because I was the guy that was getting it right, And say what you like about trading, at least it recognizes people who are right. And I think that's important. Because, I now I'm in journalism and media, and, I would encourage people, if they have time, to watch my first video on my channel, or to read my early articles for Open Democracy. All of the predictions that I made were terrible and have been right. And, at the same time, The Guardian ran an article saying that house prices are going to collapse, okay? And that was wrong, okay? And, that was Larry Elliott, who's their main economics editor. Where's the apology from Larry Elliott? Where does he say, I'm sorry, I was wrong? There isn't one. And, we live in a world, academic economics, economic media, these are places where there is no post-case recognition or punishment for being right or wrong. And what that means is the people who get the voice in those spaces are basically the people who have cultural power, because they can be right, they want there's no punishment. They, and there's no way to challenge them. In the city, at least I can walk in and say, okay, you guys are wrong, I'm right, so come and listen to me, But in the world of media, there's basically nothing like that. So what you end up with in media and academia, in my opinion, is a bunch of rich people from rich backgrounds, just chatting nonsense, being wrong all the time, and not even noticing that they're wrong, because they're never punished for being wrong. So who cares? And it's their communities that are being hurt. So who cares? And if you are somebody who actually figures out what's happening in the economy, you can get paid £1 million a year in a fucking skyscraper to shut the fuck up. So, if that is your system of economics, can you be surprised when the economy is a disaster? And, I do the work that I do for free. I don't make any money from doing it. But I could be making £2 million a year working in these skyscrapers. And I choose not to do that because I want to try and prevent this disaster from happening. But the reality is the system that we've built in academia and in the media doesn't listen to people like me, because I don't know the right people. I don't look the right way, and I don't have the right connection. So really, it's It's a disgrace, and it's comically bad. And I work with a lot of nasty people on the trading floor, but the people who I'm most angry at are these economics professors who are wrong year after year after year after year, and don't even realize.
So I don't know. I think you've got maybe a bit of a problem with your connection there, Gary. We heard like
Oh, sorry.
90% of your very accurate rant, but it was
Okay.
like, there was a little bit of breaking up there, and I'm not sure if it's on my side or your side, but I'll see what people in chat say. But it was
Yeah,
fine.
if it's
We got the
if it's
gist of it.
still me, I can try to move to another connection. Let me know.
Yeah, yeah. I'm not sure. But anyway, so yeah, thank you. I mean, I agree. So, I mean, there's been a few controversies in economics because this is really my wheelhouse, kind of the economics profession. I'm super interested in it as an economist myself. And there was, I don't know if you heard about the Reinhardt and Rogoff controversy because yeah, so they had yeah, I'm thinking these sound issues or the connection might actually be on my side because everyone else seems to be fine. So sorry about that, folks. But yeah, anyway, Reinhardt and Rogoff famously wrote a paper. It was actually unpublished, but they wrote this paper saying that when a country's debt exceeds 90% of its GDP, then it will basically experience negative growth or a recession.
Yeah.
And then it turned out, so it was cited by Paul Ryan in the US, George Osborne in the UK to justify austerity.
Yeah.
And they there was a spreadsheet error in it, just the most ridiculous spreadsheet error. That actually, I'll be completely honest with you, was so bad that people I've spoken to privately have questioned whether it was actually an accident, because
Yeah.
it was just so bad and so obvious. But they didn't face any professional consequences. There's no, you can get disbarred from being a lawyer, a doctor. You can complain about those professions if you want, but they have codes of ethics and professional mechanisms. There's
Yeah.
nothing for economists. And these people, Reinhardt and Rogoff, you can still find them writing articles. You can still find them teaching at universities, publishing research and things like
Yeah.
that. And there's absolutely no consequence.
Yeah, I think it's important to realize, right? There's basically two worlds of economics. There's the public speaking world and there's the money managing world. And it's kind of never the twain shall meet. You know what I mean? Like when I was working, you study economics and you know what the situation is, which is, when you finish your undergrad degree, if you've got a good degree from a good university, I put this in inverted commas,
Yeah.
then you have the option to go and work in the city, okay? Or you could try and go into one of these public-facing roles, which means staying and doing a master's and doing a PhD and then sort of doing some postgrad work and doing some postdoc work, and you really have to grind your way through it, okay? And if you take that second option, then you are looking at, many, many years of study for no money. You'll probably be putting yourself into debt. And then, you could get into hundreds of thousands of pounds of debt and you could be studying for 7-8 years. And then you'll be making very, very little money for many years. If you want to work in journalism, you probably have to do unpaid internships. And then maybe down the line, you might be making like 100, 200 grand, which is great. But, you'll be quite old by then. And your alternative, I went to work in the city and I was a multimillionaire at 25. And I'm from a poor background, all right? Realistically, can I afford to make that first choice? Realistically, I own this flat now, and that's from the money that I made in the city. And when my brother had to buy property, I helped him out. And my sister's trying to buy property now, and I'm gonna have to help her out. You know what I mean? So realistically, if I make that choice, what I'm saying is I will never have a property. Maybe my brother will never have property. Maybe my sister will never have property. Maybe we'll never be able to have kids. Realistically, we've created a situation where people from poor backgrounds cannot take that choice. They cannot. But then what we've also done is we've separated the knowledge, right? So, I was getting paid £1 million a year to trade European interest rates. But if you call up Citibank and say, oh, what do you think is going to happen to European interest rates? Do you think they put you on the phone to me? Of course they don't. They put you on the phone to someone who gets paid 50 grand a year and has never met me. You know what I mean? So we've had this like complete privatization of knowledge, and we've kind of created a system where it's guaranteed that the people who are advising you are posh boys who don't know what they're doing, And Michael Saunders is on the NPC now, right? sets interest rates for the Bank of England. He used to work at Citibank, and he was a joke to us. We never listened to anything he said. We no interest in that guy. You know what I mean? So it's kind of like a crazy situation where sort of nobody who ever manages money has any respect for anyone who is in the world of setting public opinion or setting public policy. And yet those are the guys who are actually in charge of fixing the economy. It's it really is quite a sad and sorry state of affairs. And, can you really expect that we're going to have a good economy for ordinary people when the economy is run by a bunch of posh guys who are in it for prestige and never even have to try and be right? It's a joke, unfortunately.
I wonder what you think. I mean, you used an interesting phrase there, which was privatization of knowledge, because essentially traders can't really speak about things because that revealing your strategy can itself kind of move the market and affect the performance and everything.
It's in your contract.
It's in your contract. Yeah, exactly.
You can't speak publicly. Yeah,
exactly. So I mean, I was wondering what kind of things, and again, we're talking broad strokes here, loose ideas, you think would improve this situation.
I've got some ideas about this. So basically, I think you could improve economics massively by doing a few simple things. I think the first thing you have to do is you have to force economists to make genuine out-of-sample predictions. And what I mean by that is predictions of the future, actually of the future, because, economists like to use this like out-of-sample technique, but only when predicting the past. And personally, in my experience, I've always found predicting the past much easier than predicting the future. So I would like them to actually try to predict the future. And, predict the future, and you're allowed to, you can make it contingent. You can say, if this happens, I think that will happen. If that happens, I think that will happen. Force economists to predict the future, and then go back and check the homework afterwards. Go back and look at economists' past predictions and how they fare up against other economists. So then somebody like me, who has a consistent track record of being right in their predictions, can come out and say, look, guys, I'm the guy who keeps being right here. Can we talk about my ideas? Because at the moment, it doesn't matter that I was one of the best paid traders in the world. It would take me years to be listened to in academia. And, I'm struggling to be listened to in the media. You know what I mean? But these guys are wrong all the time, and I've been right for years and years and years. And I can walk into any one of these skyscrapers and get paid £1 million a year. You know what I mean? We need to have a system where we protect people who are right. Because if you don't protect people who are right, then you're just protecting people who are posh. You create basically a total inside club where a bunch of like posh dickheads just like tell each other how smart they are. And they can be wrong all the time. But force them to make predictions, because then you anchor them to reality. I had a professor at Oxford who wrote a paper saying if the ECB didn't do quantitative easing, that Eurozone GDP would be like 4.7% lower or something. And I was interested because it was a concrete prediction for once. And I said to him, okay, it's good you've made a concrete prediction. Do you think it's right? And he said to me, what do you mean? And I said, what do you mean? What do you mean? Do you think it's right? And he was like, I don't understand the question. And I said, do you think that if the ECB didn't do QE, Eurozone GDP would be 4.7% lower? And he said, I don't understand what you mean. These guys, they are not incentivized to be right. And they are not incentivized to understand what's happening. And they're not incentivized to give accurate answers. They are incentivized to write very complicated, mathematically adventurous papers that everyone else will get excited about. But they're not trying to be right because they're not incentivized to be right. If you want these guys to be right and to understand, you need to incentivize them to do something that is connected to reality and is actually difficult, like make accurate predictions of the future. And they need to judge them on that. Because then somebody who is against the mainstream can come out and say something which is unpopular or unfashionable and be recognized as good because he's consistently right. And otherwise, you will not advance your knowledge. If you do not have any way for people from low power backgrounds to challenge the status quo and be recognized for being right, then you will not improve your understanding. You need to force economists to make predictions of the future and analyze them afterwards, because then economists will start trying to be right. If you want economists to be right, reward them for being right, punish them for being wrong. We are not doing that.
Yeah, I do agree with that. I think it's amazing. One of the things that always amazes me is when you look at the Bank of England's forecast, and this will be the same for any central bank. It's just like you look at them and they've got all their past forecasts in the graph, and they're all
Yeah,
just wrong. And you're just like,
yeah.
why do you keep doing this? Like,
See,
it's completely ridiculous.
watching economic forecasts is like watching a penalty shootout where every penalty goes off for throwing on the same side. Whatever they forecast, they are always consistently wrong by a sizable margin in the same direction forever. And yet, and it's just the one that no other profession would it be allowed. You know, if you had a doctor whose every patient died, he would stop being a doctor. If you had an architect whose every bridge fell down, he would stop being an architect. If you had a weather forecast who always said tomorrow's going to be 40 degrees and sunny, he would not be a weather forecaster anymore. And yet, in economics, it's allowed, and these guys thrive, and these guys have careers, and these guys they live in nice big houses with nice lovely families, and they get well paid, and it's amazing. But you know, you've got to be impressed at how they've managed to sort of carve such a successful careers out of this constant stupidity.
That's quite a turn of phrase. So what? So a slightly different question. So this is something that I've seen you touch on in your channel. I wouldn't say it's a focus of your channel just yet, but you seem to be maybe moving in that direction. Is a bit of investment advice for people. So you, like you said, you're an experienced trader, and so investment advice, financial advice in general. So do you
Mhm.
have any kind of practical advice, and especially for poorer people who are feeling the brunt of the cost of living
Yeah, yeah,
crisis
yeah.
now, on these things?
Okay, yeah. So I get messaged a lot about investment advice. So there's a video on my channel called Basics of Investing. If anyone wants to know about it, I would recommend they watch it. Um, this is a hard one, and the reason for this is, I'm from a poor background, okay, and I know what people who are from poor backgrounds who are in difficult situations are thinking. They're thinking, what the hell can I do to get me out of the situation, to protect myself, to protect my family, and then they're looking for ways to deal with it. But unfortunately, investing is an activity which is not generally particularly profitable for people who are not already rich. And that's very easy to explain, okay? So, I've already said rich people make about 3 to 5%, on their wealth. It will vary a lot person to person, year to year, but that's sort of a decentish average, okay? To say rich people make 3 to 5% of their wealth, okay? So then if you are Rishi Sunak and you're worth nearly £1 billion, you're going to be making, 20, 30, 40 million pounds a year, which is obviously an enormous amount of money, okay? Or if you come in with, say, £2 million, then, if you make 5% on £2 million, you're making 100 grand a year, which is it's not 30 million pounds, but you can easily live a comfortable life on 100 grand a year, right? But most people don't have 2 million pounds, and if you're coming to me with the kind of savings which a lot of ordinary people might have, which is 10, 20, 30,000 pounds, say you come to me with 30,000 pounds, if you make 5% a year, which is a good return on 30,000 pounds, then you're making 1,500 pounds a year, which is great. No one's going to say no to 1,500 pounds a year, but that's not going to change your life, right? And you have to put quite a lot of time and effort and study into making that 5%, right? So the reality of the situation is that investing is just not significantly, consistently profitable usage of time for people in ordinary or poorer financial positions. So then I'm put in a situation where the reason I really made the channel is to help ordinary people who are often in worse and worse situations. But when it comes to giving investment advice, the truth is most ordinary people can't make much money from investing. And I think there's a few sort of people and industries which have grown up around this problem, which is that ordinary people are desperate to protect their financial situation, and yet they don't really have any good safe options. I would hasten to add, even when we talk about that 5%, the only way you're going to make 5% from investing is by taking some significant amount of risk, which means you might actually end up losing money, which is something that most ordinary people can't afford to do, right? So because ordinary people are in bad situations and they don't have any safe, secure ways out of it, then you see, for example, Bitcoin and crypto come up saying like, well, we can make you loads of money, overnight if you just pick the right coin. Or you see some people on Instagram or some people on YouTube selling, for example, day trading strategies, foreign exchange trading strategies, and they might advertise it in ways which are very misleading by, for example, saying, guaranteed money, 100% of trades make money. And often the strategies which they're selling are actually very risky in ways which might not be immediately apparent. So, I've got the video up there, which is Basics of Investing. If anyone wants to watch it, they can watch it. But unfortunately, it's going to deliver the truth of the situation, which is that whilst there are things you can do, and those are discussed in the video, investing is not a secure, safe way out of bad financial situations. Unfortunately, it's just not. And there are things you can do. You can try and reduce your expenditures, and I would encourage people to not keep huge amounts of savings in cash and look to diversify into things like stocks. Or I hold a lot of gold. I would advise people to avoid cryptocurrencies and avoid sort of day trading strategies. That stuff is all explained in the video. But what I also say in the video is that ultimately, the economy as a whole is being made systematically worse and worse for ordinary families. So if we're all out there just trying to invest and trade for ourselves, then that will keep happening. And really, I think we're reaching a point now. I think it's interesting you see Martin Lewis, this famous money saving expert, coming out and saying, I can't protect you anymore. And I think we're reaching a point now where this strategy of I'm going to take care of me and I'm going to take care of my family is basically reaching the limits of its feasibility as a strategy. And I think now people need to start looking outside and saying, look, we're being really damaged here by the system, which is benefiting the super rich. And our only real way to stop that is to start looking to build bridges with other people in similar situations so we can push back as a group politically. Because if we don't achieve systemic change, then I guarantee you most of our kids and grandkids will be really struggling. So, I do give bits and bobs of investment advice, and partially it's to bring new people into the channel because I'm trying to grow the channel. And partially it's to help people where I can. But unfortunately, we're past that now, and we will continue to be past that. And we're moving into a situation now where realistically, if ordinary people want to defend themselves and their families, I firmly believe they do have to start acting politically. And I don't mean that in the sense of you have to join this political party or that political party. What I mean is you have to be prepared to build bonds of community with your friends, your family, the people around you, to come back and take back power and take back resources. And that's ultimately what the mission of my channel is to try and create a space where people can do that. So yeah, there's investment advice on there, but the investment advice is real, which is unfortunately there's only so much you can achieve by investing, and that's not the message a lot of people want to hear, but it's the message I believe.
Yeah, it's kind of it's quite frank and sobering, I think, because there's so many so many I don't know get rich quick schemes out there, and people looking to exploit people and get them to trade. But like you said, if you don't have that much money to start with, it's much harder.
You can't treble or quintuple your money without doing things that are basically crazy. And if anyone is selling you that, I think one thing, if anyone is selling on the internet, if anyone says risk-free, zero risk, if anyone is selling you returns of like anything more than like 10% a year, really, especially if they're saying it's zero risk, that's a red flag. It's probably basically that's a con, and you should stay away.
Yeah. So, one specific question on that. What do you think of, and there's a lot of hate for them out there, TikTok investors?
I don't have TikTok, so it's a friend of mine who runs my YouTube, and he's encouraging me to get involved in TikTok. So I haven't really seen it. I've seen a lot of people on YouTube and Instagram. The TikTok guy, the YouTube and Instagram guys are bad enough. The TikTok guys worse.
I mean, yeah, it's gotten pretty bad. I mean, I had to delete TikTok because it's just the most addictive app of all time. But there's like Twitter accounts devoted to it, detailing the worst of TikTok investors and everything. And yeah, they just sort of they seem like complete scams. You could make £100,000 overnight with this one quick trick and all that type of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of scammy stuff on there, but I understand the situation people are in, man. I've said it a number of times. I come from a poor background, and I know that people are being put in a really difficult position, and what they're trying to do is trying to find ways that they can support themselves or their family, or try and find ways to pull themselves up in a world which doesn't offer a lot of opportunities to that, man. So really, like, I'm not coming out of this with hate, because I understand that people are just trying to do the best in difficult situations. But these are not answers. So and the real answers are difficult, and they will take a long time. and it requires, you know, organizing with other people and educating yourself and people around you and being prepared to fight some difficult fights. And you know, the long, difficult road is not as attractive as you know, this one quick trick will make you a millionaire in 2 months, you know. But this is the fight we have to fight, and I'm just hoping that people will see the authenticity and the kind of voice that I'm pushing out, as opposed to these voices which may sound superficially more appealing. Because yeah, ultimately the political fight is what will matter, and yeah, you know, don't be scammed by these guys, don't be conned as much as it. If it sounds too good to be true, it probably is.
Devote your energy to politics and awareness and learning and
Yeah, and
organising
building
rather
bonds,
than
building bonds,
investing.
man. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
So we've got some questions from the chat. If you don't mind doing a little bit of Q&A, Gary.
Yeah, I don't know where the chat is. You'll tell me them, will
Oh,
you?
I've got. I'll tell you
Yeah.
the questions. Don't worry. So Tas for 10 asks, asks me to ask you about tax havens and what you think their role is in all of this.
Yeah, so like the fact of the matter is that very, very wealthy people are at the moment often able to pay very, very low rates of tax. You might hear these statistics like the top 1% of people pay 30% of tax, but that's actually the top 1% of taxpayers that pay 30% of tax. So there'll be a lot of very, very rich people who are not in that top 1% of taxpayers because they're able to completely avoid tax. So yeah, these guys avoid tax. I think probably the most interesting thing about tax havens is that we're kind of sold this myth that, well, we can't tax them because of the tax havens. We can't tax them. And I think what really sort of the only single good thing to come out of this obviously terrible situation, which is the Ukraine war, is that the government turns around and says we're going to tax Roman Abramovich, and then Roman Abramovich realizes that it doesn't matter if he flies off to the Maldives or to the Cayman Islands or whatever. Chelsea Football Club is still in Chelsea. And I think this highlights a deeper truth about the taxation of rich people, which is rich people are rich. You know, it's not, these guys are not Gandalf. It's not like a magic that they own. They're rich because they own our assets. They own your mortgage. They own your house, quite possibly. They own the office that you go to work in. They own the shops that you shop in. They own the fields from where the food comes from that you eat. They're rich because they own assets. And if they go to the Cayman Islands, the assets are still here. You know, ultimately, Roman Abramovich was not able to put Chelsea Football Club in a bag and take it to the Cayman Islands. The only reason that we can't, or more realistically don't, tax people when their assets are held in a tax haven is because we choose to recognize that method of ownership. And we don't have to do that. And it really raised this question of, well, then why? Why? You know, imagine all the rich people just went off and lived in the Cayman Islands, right? All of their assets are in the West, largely, you know, and all of their companies sell to the West, largely. So why don't we just tax them on the assets themselves instead of where they choose to legally domicile the assets? And if you want to know my honest opinion, I think you probably need to say, look at the fact that our most recent chancellor, his father-in-law was one of the richest men in the world, and he's worth £700 million. And David Cameron made £10 million within a year of leaving office. And Tony Blair is worth, what, 60, 70 million pounds, you know? So why would they stop legitimizing tax havens? Because they're all really, really rich. Yeah, I think it's as simple as that. And, you know, if we say we're going to tax the assets where the assets are, as opposed to where you tell us the assets are, then we can tax them. We can tax them. But, you know, at the moment, it's not really in the politicians' interest to do that because definitely their donors, and in many cases they themselves, are very rich. And often they themselves go on to use the tax havens. So, yeah, you know, the tax havens are only powerful because our politicians choose to give them power and our lawyers choose to give them the power. So we need to exercise our power politically to make sure they stop doing that.
Mm-hmm. That's a refreshingly optimistic view of our ability to tax, even with the existence of tax havens. And Katharina Pistor, I think, wrote. I'm blanking on the name of the book, but it's a book about how law creates inequality, basically, which is kind of like your argument. You know, if you choose to recognise certain assets in a certain way, then rich people will get richer. Yeah. So let me move on to the next question. Random850 asks, so you were talking about trading. How can I talk my friends out of day trading when they're convinced it will make them rich?
I mean, yeah, this is something I've experienced in my life, and it's quite sad. I had a conversation with a friend where he was saying, "Oh, I've made so much money day trading, blah blah blah. I bought this car from it," and I said to him, "Do you think you've made money like over the course of the whole thing?" And he's like, "Yeah, yeah, yeah." I was like, "What? Like the whole thing, the whole time trading? You think you've made money?" And he was like, "Well, I lost a lot of money at first, but that was just me learning how to do it. It took a bit of time, but now I'm making money. And it's just a very dangerous mentality. And most of what these people are doing, most of and most if they're day trading, most of what they're doing is nonsense, in my opinion. I think they might as well be playing roulette. Um, how can you get somebody out of it? It's hard, man, and I think this is where sort of the media is dropping the ball a little bit because people have gambling addictions, right? But people who have gambling addictions, well, sometimes they themselves do fool themselves. You see people who think they have a strategy to beat roulette and are addicted to roulette or addicted to slot machines. But at least the message society sends is that gambling is dangerous. Whereas when it comes to things like trading, I think increasingly society, especially things like crypto, although it's changing a little bit recently, society is sending a bit of a message like this is investing and this is the right sort of thing to do, and it's like a good decision for you and for your family and for your future. I mean, you can show them my videos. I did a video with Matt Zarb cousin, who's a gambling organizer. What's the name? Gamban is the name of his organization. You can try and show them my videos, but I think that the truth is, unfortunately, often when people are really in this, it's very, very difficult to get them out. And how can you persuade them? You can try and reason with them. You can try and be there for them and try and open their eyes to it. If you're very, very close to them, you might be able to get them to see sense. But really, ultimately, like it's an addiction. It's just like an addiction to drugs. When people are in that, there's very little you can do. So try and keep their eyes open where you can. But unfortunately, personally, I found it difficult. And if anyone wants to give ways to do it, let me know, because it affects my friends as well. And I would like to be able to save these people from these things, but it's not easy to do.
Yeah. So would you recommend any books to read? Grim Freeberg asks.
About the economy or about trading or?
Well, I don't know. It's general, so let's say both.
Honestly, I've probably given the impression that I don't really like economists. There's a few economists that I like. I like Gabriel Zuckman. I like Piketty, although I don't think all of his books are the most readable. I really like Ha-Joon Chang. I think he's a great person. I think he communicates well. These guys often talk about different things than me. Zuckman talks a lot about inequality like me. Yeah, I've got a website which you can read. It takes about 45 minutes, 50 minutes to read. I know I'm plugging my own stuff, but I rate myself. So I think I'm a good economist. That's called wealtheconomics.org. So that's, I've got, obviously there's the YouTube, but if you like to sort of read, and the website is a lot more like strictly economic analysis. Otherwise, books, I don't really read that much. I talk to other people, talk to other traders. Those are the guys that I like: Ha-Joon Chang, Gabriel Zuckman. Have you got any that you would recommend?
Well, yeah. No, those are all good suggestions. Yeah, I mean, you're right. Piketty's books are very long, if nothing else, and extremely academic. I think it was
Maybe
there was there was that somebody released the data from Kindles, because Amazon can tell how far people have read through it. So while it was the best selling economics book for a long time, or maybe of all time, Capital, his first one, it was like people on average got to page 26 out of 600.
I read the whole thing. I'm very proud of myself.
Did you? I did. It took a while. It did take a while. But yeah.
I should probably mention that I'm in the process of writing a book, but it's going to be more of a trading memoir than an economics book, although there will be a lot of economics in there. But that won't be out for another about a year and a half. But yeah, obviously that.
Okay, well, yeah, no, that's cool. I look forward to the release of that. Yeah. There's the one, the Katharina Pistor, the one that I mentioned is pretty good on how sort of law creates inequality. Nicholas Shaxson is a journalist, and he's written one book about tax havens specifically, and I think it's called Treasure Islands, and then he wrote another one about financialization more generally, maybe called The Finance Curse, a bit later. So those two are probably pretty good on this topic as well.
Of Injustice is my favorite book from Gabriel Zuckman. I think it's not too long and it's relatively readable. By the standards,
what's it called? Sorry.
The Triumph of
The
Injustice.
Triumph of Injustice. Okay, I
It
haven't
might
read
just
any of
be, it
Zygmunt's
might just
books.
be Triumph of Injustice. So that's readable. Yeah, I read it and I liked it.
Um, okay, and I think let's so let's go with one more question, and it's it's a big one and it's inevitable. So, from MLMs, crypto, NFTs, trading, etc. What do you think is going on in terms of collective psychology? It all seems a bit culty, but why?
I mean, I'm not an expert on this, but I don't think it's complicated, right? I think that you've put people in. All right, listen. My dad worked for a post office for 35 years. Okay, he never went to university. He never had any like particularly amazing skills. But on that, he was able to buy a house and raise 3 kids. And we were never rich, but now he's owns his own property and he's retired, and him and my mum have a comfortable life. You can't do that now. You cannot do that now. There's people in this city outside sleeping on the streets with jobs. Um, the idea, I've got a mate who makes 70 grand a year. He's been sleeping on his mum's sofa for the last like 3 or 4 years, and he can't buy a house. We are putting people in very, very difficult personal situations with no realistic, legitimate way of improving their situations. And when you do that, especially when you live in a society which puts a lot of emphasis on being rich and being successful and sort of associates it with sort of personal worth, you make people go insane, basically. And it's a disaster for mental health, especially that of men, but not just that of men. And then they look for ways out, right? They look for ways out, and they want a way out. And I think people are very deeply aware that what is happening to our economy is not working and is not getting better. And I think if people know that their ship is sinking, then you're on a ship and it's sinking. You don't check the lifeboat thoroughly for holes, right? You jump on and you get rowing, and that's what people are doing. That's what people are doing. We're putting people in bad situations here, man, and people want to get out. And then there's also just the classic speculative bubble stuff. Some people make a load of money. They post a load of pictures on Instagram with themselves with Lamborghinis, and everybody wants to get involved. And I think you're a student of economics. You will have read about the tulip bubble and other historic manias and bubbles, and you kind of read about it and you think, wow, that's crazy. How did that happen? And then you see what happened in front of your eyes. And it's just a few things about collective psychology. People, it's FOMO. People don't want to miss out. But I think that the more serious story is that, when work isn't working, you want to find something that works, don't you? And people are looking for alternatives, and unfortunately, they're getting often taken advantage of.
Yeah, it's an argument to really look at the situation and the context and see basically something like NFTs as a symptom, right, rather than a cause.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, so I think I think it's a good time to stop. So I mean, so two questions. Number one, was there anything that you kind of wanted to talk about that we didn't touch on? And number two, you've already done a bit of plugging, but if you want to do a bit more plugging for your channel and everything, then please go ahead.
Yeah, I will plug a bit, just because, I know I've said a lot of things in this interview, which are not nice things to say and not nice things to hear, right? And I don't want us to be in a space where things are like the way that they are, right? And I think more and more people are seeing now just how serious this economic situation is becoming. And it's no longer just about sort of the bottom 10, 20%, things are going to get a lot more serious, and a lot of people are going to fall into relatively serious financial situations, right? I do the work that I do because I think that's avoidable, and I think we can avoid it. But it's not going to be easy, and it's going to require us to build bridges, across the kind of divides that might divide us. Like, do you own property? Do you not own property? Are you from London? Are you from the north? Across some of the divides that we've been encouraged to get aggressive about, like race and gender, right? I think I'm trying to build a space where ordinary people from ordinary backgrounds can understand what's happening, can educate themselves, their families, their friends, their workmates, their communities, and then can come together and say, look, we're all being screwed here. Let's push back. So, yeah, I've got the YouTube out there. I'm working on the book. I've got Twitter and I've got Instagram. And if people want to support that, then that's great. Come follow, and if you can watch some videos, if you like them, share them with your friends.
They're all pretty much called Gary's Economics, aren't they? Pretty much
everything
is just yeah.
Twitter. The only thing that's different is the website, which is wealtheconomics.org. But Twitter, YouTube, Instagram. There's a Facebook page as well, Gary's Economics. The YouTube is kind of my baby, but the Twitter is, I post on it regularly as well. But it's not just about me, right? This is about trying to change things for the better. So, share it with your friends and your family, because, I'm trying to build something where we can have some power to push back. So I would really appreciate any support.
Yeah, and I hope your message gets out there more, because, I've been watching a lot of your channel before this chat, and I think you do a really good job at communicating it in plain language, as I said at the beginning. So thanks a lot, Gary, and thank you everybody. Thank you, chat. There's been a lot of interesting discussions in chat, and some good questions. So I'll see you all soon.